You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Orn Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Book Talk Today podcast. And the next 3 episodes are a special series showcasing the books that Wired magazine editors have written in partnership with Penguin RandomHouse on climate change, the future of medicine, and artificial intelligence. I'm taking the time to sit down with each one of these authors and to discuss the book and the topics in more depth. Today's episode is with James Temperton, who wrote a book on the future of medicine. James and I had a wonderful discussion about the future implications of medicine, what some of the technologies that are currently out there, and also the research that is being done on the subject. With COVID-19, over the past year or so, the medical industry has been at the forefront of not only a revolution, but also the media to have a look at their rollout and also the speed in which the industry can react to a pandemic such as COVID-19. We had a great conversation about COVID-19 and its impacts, as well as what the future of medicine will look like. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 20 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today, we are joined by James Temperton. James is the digital editor at Wired UK, as well as the leading titles digital strategy. He also reports regularly on the gig economy and a scourge of online disinformation. Today, we will be discussing his book, The Future of Medicine, How We Will Enjoy Longer, Healthier Lives. James, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I found your book to be incredibly insightful. There was a lot of technical information in there that I felt like you were able to distill into a nice readable format for the reader. So in such a short book and such a thin book, I think it's difficult, obviously, as we were discussing just before, distilling that information into a short piece of readable information. I think a great place to start with would be what initially drew you to writing this book.
Yeah, so when we were putting together ideas for the series of books that Wired's been working on, the COVID pandemic was just getting into full swing. And there's never been a more relevant time to talk about healthcare systems and access to healthcare. Big pharmaceutical companies, when I was researching and reporting this book in the spring of last year, the pandemic was getting worse and worse by the day, and to a degree it still is, even though huge progress has been made in terms of vaccines and treatments. So this book is, in a way, a story of the lessons that we must learn from the pandemic. So it has a huge amount of relevance, slightly sadly more relevance than I ever imagined it might have when I started working on it.
Interesting. When you came to write it, part of the book obviously references COVID-19 and the efforts and what individuals have been doing in response to it, but also its impact. How did that affect your research into the book?
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter about the future of diagnosis, which focuses quite heavily on COVID-19, and the chapter that follows it regarding understanding the body on a cellular level. What's been fascinating about our approach to the pandemic is how we've accelerated the use and development of technologies that were already being worked on in the laboratory and brought them to bear on treatments that are now available to the public and physicians in hospitals. So it's incredibly challenging for the medical industry to go from being quite slow and understandably risk averse to very, very rapidly innovating and bringing new treatments to market. And when you're working on a book in the midst of that, it's incredibly energizing because you're speaking to people who have spent the last several weeks and months making huge progress on the development of treatments and vaccines for a disease that is killing many tens of thousands of people. And it's their work that's allowing us to see a way out of this pandemic. So speaking to those people and understanding their stories and reporting their stories was a huge honor and a privilege. And what's interesting looking back at the book, it's now sort of a year since I started reporting and researching it, is the work that they were doing then is having a real impact now. And when I was speaking to them a year or so ago, it was hoped that the research and the collaboration that was going on in the scientific community would give us a way out of this pandemic. And thankfully, that seems to be the case.
Yeah, it does. It was interesting when I was reading the book. It must be interesting for you to actually read back to it to see obviously the journey that these scientists have gone through, because at that time obviously a lot wasn't being mentioned about the work perhaps that was going on behind the scenes. Have you been speaking to those doctors since the publication or during that process, and how have they found it to be?
Yeah, so I've been in touch with a few of them to thank them for their time, obviously,
Yeah.
and let them know that the book's coming out, and have regularly been keeping in touch with the work that they've been doing. So there's one project called the Human Cell Atlas, which is effectively a global collaboration to categorize and understand every single cell in the human body. There's billions and billions of cells. It's a remarkable achievement of scientific collaboration, far bigger in scope than the Human Genome Project, which your listeners might be more familiar with. And what the Human Cell Atlas has allowed researchers to do with regards to COVID-19 is understand specifically what it does when it gets inside the human body. So the Human Cell Atlas has a vast database of human cell tissue, and that gives it a baseline for what a healthy organ, what all the organs in the body look like when they're healthy. It was then able to take samples of people who were infected with severe COVID-19 and see the differences. And what they were able to do very, very early in the pandemic is give the global scientific community an incredibly clear understanding of how this disease progressed through the human body and which areas of the human body it affected. And what they were able to see really backed up what doctors were experiencing in emergency departments and intensive care units around the world, that this seemed like it was a respiratory disease, but it was a disease that was affecting pretty much every system in the body in a really, really severe way. And without that understanding that the Human Cell Atlas was able to bring, the development of treatments for this disease would have been slower. And it's remarkable to think that ordinarily, as I said, the scientific community, the healthcare community moves slowly with good justification. But it's proven over the last year that if the funding is there, if the political support is there, and if the necessity is there, it can move incredibly quickly. You know, we've developed not just one vaccine that's incredibly effective, we've developed a whole suite of vaccines that are very, very different and all effective in different ways. And we've done that in less than a year. And in countries like Israel, where the vaccine rollout has gone incredibly well, it's already looking like we're going to be out of the very, very worst of this pandemic in just over a year. Whereas without all the work that's been going on in the background for several years at institutions like the Human Cell Atlas, we wouldn't be in the position that we are now to effectively win the battle against the virus.
That necessity aspect, I think, or what you said was key, because I think if people are not aligned on that one goal, it's difficult because political interests come into it, and different interests obviously come into it, as well as funding. From your perspective, how difficult was it to go about writing a book like this with the speed of change based on the doctors, obviously, and the professionals trying to come up with this vaccine, but obviously the lack of perhaps accurate information that was going out into the public? Did you find that affecting you as well, trying to decipher what was the critical information and important information and which wasn't?
Yeah, and as you rightly said, it's not the longest book in the world. It's sort of 140 odd pages and kind of pocket sized to go with it. So there's not a lot of pages to play with. And when you've got a very fast moving story like the pandemic, that presents a challenge. So the premise of the book is that we need to move towards a model of precision medicine, that we need to go from developing treatments for the many to treatments for the few. Now, how that relates to the pandemic, when vaccines are being developed that are going to be given to billions of people, is in the granularity of the data that allows us to develop those vaccines and to develop treatments. So, for example, where the book focuses on treatments for COVID-19 with regards to the Human Cell Atlas, if you have granular detail on individual patients, then two people who present at hospital with COVID-19 who are the same age, appear to be in the same kind of condition, might then be given the same kind of treatments. But if you really, really understood what the disease was doing in their body to them as an individual, then it might become clear that one person in several days would be on the verge of death, whereas another would be back home with their family well on the road to recovery. And we've seen that happen throughout the pandemic, that seemingly at random, people whose age profile and health profile suggest that they shouldn't be affected by severe disease are being severely affected by COVID-19. And some of them, many of them, are losing their lives. It's a huge tragedy. But what more granular precision data will allow us to do is to take those two people who, on the face of it, if we treat diseases and conditions on population scale, on the face of it, they are statistically similar. Actually, they're not. And the way that they're affected by COVID-19 kind of reveals that. So yes, it is quite difficult to take a story as fast moving as the pandemic and put it in the printed word, and then wait several months for that book to come out. But by taking the view that the situation would be very, very different in a year, the real focus on the storytelling around the pandemic was the development of our understanding of the disease and how that might allow us to treat it and other viruses similar to it in the future.
The interesting thing that I found from your book was the emphasis on the data aspect of it, because I found that very interesting about precision data for each individual, and where in the future how we go about prescribing medications or treatments based on individual data. One thing I wanted to discuss was with wearable technologies. In the book you mentioned the Whoop strap, and obviously Apple have their own version of it, and you've got is it the Aura ring? I've seen that floating around as well. So you've got different wearable technologies. Now we've seen in the last couple of years a pushback from big companies, social media companies who have data essentially. So something I wanted to discuss was, what are the potential challenges for these companies that are accessing or will have access to human data about the way our bodies function? How do they go about creating a system where that data can't be hacked or can't be misused in some sort of way?
It's a big challenge, particularly when some of the biggest players in this space are American. We're in the very incredibly fortunate position in the United Kingdom of having the National Health Service. A lot of the people, most of the people, in fact, that I spoke to for this book are based in the United States or work for American academic institutions or research institutes. So with regards wearables and using precision data to create better diagnoses for patients, I spent quite a bit of time speaking to Michael Snyder, who's the chair of the genetics department at Stanford University. And Snyder spent well on a decade now, I think, living his own experiment. So he's worn countless trackers and gadgets and gizmos and submitted himself to all kinds of tests to develop what he sees as the future of medicine. When you go to see a GP now, they maybe take your blood pressure and your temperature and ask you a few questions. You've got sort of 11 minutes, something like that in the UK for that appointment, and you'll turn up because you feel unwell. What Snyder wants to do is move us to a precision preventative form of medicine, but that requires collecting huge amounts of data. So he was a human guinea pig and ran a trial with over 100 other volunteers to basically try and hoover up as much information about their bodies and their health as possible, so that preventative decisions could be made. So what if, for example, we could diagnose diabetes before it even existed? What if we could understand who's more likely to develop certain health conditions based on their genetics, or what Snyder refers to as your omic profiles? The ohm that your listeners might be most familiar with is your microbiome. There's a lot of focus on that in nutritional science. So what Snyder proposes is that when you go and see your doctor in the future, rather than them going, okay, you're James, you're in your 30s, and you have no family history of this, that, or the other, and you're telling me that you're having headaches or blurred vision or whatever, I'm going to take your blood pressure, I might take a urine sample or a stool sample or a blood sample, et cetera, and I might send you off for further tests. That's what we've got right now. What Snyder proposes is that from birth, your your genome will be sequenced, and omic profiling will be done to understand your immune system, your microbiome, all the different ohms within your body, the things that make you who you are and who make you get ill as an individual rather than a population-based average. That's a huge amount of data. At the top, I said we're very fortunate in the UK to have the NHS. So the NHS is already doing this to a degree. Tens of thousands of people's genomes are stored by the NHS, and that's going to be scaled up into the millions over the coming years. And this is an incredibly valuable trove of data for research companies, for pharmaceutical companies, and for the NHS itself. Once you add genetic data to people's medical records, they go from being worth just a few dollars to being worth thousands of dollars. This data is absolute gold dust. And as you said yourself, we've got the likes of Apple and Google and potentially Facebook, Microsoft, etc. All of our favorite big tech companies sniffing around in this space because the healthcare industry is worth a huge amount of money, and there's massive untapped potential here. So there's definitely going to be a necessity for regulators to get on top of this in a way that they haven't got on top of Google and Facebook, et cetera, to date. It's going to be a very different discussion, one would imagine, in the UK than it would be in the US or other places in the world. Canada has a public health system, and many European countries have public health systems similar to the NHS. But your question of making sure that data isn't hacked or misused, or once that data exists, what's to stop a medical insurance company or your employer having access to some aspect of that data? Snyder's perspective, and he's the real expert here, is that data belongs to you, and you should have ultimate control over how it is used and how it is analyzed, and an understanding of the processes that are involved in doing that. So we're going to have to come up with new contracts for how data is used, and we're going to have to come up with a new economic model. Back in the day, people somewhat tediously referred to data as the new oil. We can't treat medical data in the same way. It's not a commodity. It's yours. It belongs to you. And we're going to need some really, really smart regulation to make sure that we don't get the same Wild West industry popping up around medical data once we move to personalized medicine, as we have had pop up around people's personal data in the digital economy.
Definitely. And I think you can either be an optimist or a pessimist, like any of these sort of topics, whether it comes to medicine or AI and these types of subjects. I think there's one camp of people who are obviously an optimist, like Dr. Schneider is, and then you have sort of the pessimists who want to go live in the forest somewhere and not want to have to wear anything. So they fall into two camps. Interesting. One thing that you picked up on was the differences between medical industries in the US and the UK in particular. Was that self-evident when you were doing your research to find the gaps or the differences? Was that enhanced when you were doing this research to find out the differences between the privatized system in the US and the National Health Service in the UK?
When you're talking about something like precision data-led medical care, there's a huge advantage to having a nationalized health system. So even though most of the work to date in this area has been conducted, certainly in the English-speaking world, in the United States, countries that are best set up to introduce this kind of care are the ones that have single point of entry health systems, rather than the very, very convoluted and messy system that the US is world famous for. So their perspective was that, many of the experts that I spoke to, their perspective was that the NHS, and as has been shown, holds data of huge value. And as we move down this path to precision medicine, will further bolster its position as one of the strongest players in medical data and research and analysis around that medical data. But when it comes to other challenges for the future of medicine, the research work that's going on in laboratories all around the world, it's really the case of funding and good regulation. There are huge challenges for the pharmaceutical industry as we move from developing treatments that are designed for millions of people to treatments that are designed for just thousands or hundreds or maybe just even a handful of people, or maybe just one person. Those treatments already exist. The technology is there to develop them. What's lacking is the economic models and the regulatory pathways to bring down the cost and speed up the process of getting them to market. So the science is there. What we don't necessarily have is the political will and the corporate appetite to change the way we do medicine.
I know you gave an example of one individual who received prescriptive one pill, I think it was, in the book, and the initial cost was something like $500,000, and then the initial 1 year sort of setup fees, or not setup fees, but sort of initial payments was an additional like 375,000 a year. So the like you said, the science is there, but the economics isn't. What is that economic system? Is it funded? Is it sort of a mix between private and government, or do you see it being solely led by private industry?
So the opening chapter of the book tells the story of a girl called Mila, who has an incredibly rare genetic condition called Battons disease. When Mila was diagnosed, it's a fatal disease that has really, really horrible symptoms. When Mila was diagnosed as a young child, her mother did what many parents do in that situation. She sort of turned to the frontiers of medicine to see if there might be a solution, if there might be a way of treating her daughter. And working with a very, very talented team of doctors led by a doctor from Boston called Tim Yu, a treatment was developed. It's called Milason. It's named after the little girl who has Battons. It seems to have worked. Batten is caused by what's known as a jumping gene. So if you imagine your genetic sequence is the alphabet A to Z, what happens with Batten is a small bit of the alphabet jumps to where it shouldn't be. So it would read A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. So the alphabet is still there in its entirety. Your genetic code still exists. It's just the process of reading it has this random piece of code. What the doctors were able to develop is an ASO amenable genetic treatment. And what this does is it just puts a plaster over it. It's like putting Tipex on a mistake. It then allows your genetic code to be read successfully. So it will read A, B, C, D, and then there'll be a gap, which says nothing, and then E, F, G, H, I, J, K. It works. The treatment worked. Unfortunately, in Mila's case, Batten is a very, very aggressive disease and have progressed too far for the treatment to do much more than slow its progress, lessen the severity of some of the symptoms. But some of the problems that the doctors that developed this treatment had was when they went to pharmaceutical companies to get the drug made, it was quite easy to get it made in a way that was suitable for use in a laboratory, certainly not for use in human beings. The precision required for developing that kind of treatment for one individual in a way that is safe for humans to take makes it economically completely unviable, mainly because pharmaceutical companies don't want to make enough for one person. They want to make enough for thousands, hundreds, millions of people. The perspective of the doctors who developed this treatment was that you need to change the regulation to make it economically viable for companies to develop individual treatments quickly and at smaller scale. They're still going to be expensive. These are going to be amongst some of the most expensive treatments in the world, but they're only expensive because the economic model doesn't exist to allow them to be cheaper. Pharmaceutical companies are geared up because the cost of the research that goes into these sort of treatments is phenomenal, particularly with ASO amenable rare genetic conditions such as Battens disease. But the doctors that I spoke to that developed the condition, Tim Yu, compared the technology that's required to make it to being similar to a soft serve ice cream machine, the sort that you see in the back of an ice cream truck in a park on a summer's day. So it's not particularly big. You tap a few buttons and you crank a handle, you wait a little while, and the drug pops out. To make a slightly different version of that drug for a slightly different condition, you just change the instructions, crank the handle, out comes another drug. If you're able to smooth out the regulatory pathway that you need to get through to get to that point, then the cost comes down. And once you have pharmaceutical companies that are prepared to develop treatments in that way and come up with economic models to make that kind of treatment successful, then all of a sudden, yes, it's still expensive, but it's viable. So what was developed for Mila, the drug Milason, there's a fridge of this stuff sitting at a hospital in Boston. So if another child were to be born with the same condition as Mila, with the exact same genetic mutation driving it, there would be more than a lifetime's worth of treatments. And what Dr. Yu and his team are now working on is going from one case study to 2 to 3 to 4. Can they work with other families to show that this can be a successful way of treating very rare genetic conditions? And even though they're very rare, these sort of things still affect millions of children around the world every year. And the hope is that with the right support from regulators and from pharmaceutical companies, that the science is there, the need is there, we can do this. we can, if not cure, we can dramatically slow the progress of these diseases, and within our lifetimes ensure that children who are born with these conditions, which we'd be able to detect either at birth or even earlier, we'd either be able to alter their genome right there and then, or we'd be able to apply a treatment further down the line to make sure that that genetic mutation wasn't something that dictated their lives and dramatically shortened their lives.
That example you gave in the book of Dr. Yu and sort of cranking it and the pill coming out made me think about potentially in the future each one of us having perhaps a small box in our homes and just plugging in like, how are you feeling, and you can just put in some settings like you do sometimes when you go onto a website, and it gives you sort of like a list of things based on your prescriptions, and it sort of just gives you a pill. I thought perhaps that will be the future of medicine.
Yeah, well, it's certainly preventative. You go and see a doctor because you feel ill. Would be your doctor calling you up and going, "Hello, we've spotted something. There's nothing to worry about. Come in and see us, and we'll give you the treatment that you need for it." And that treatment might just be do a bit of exercise, change your diet. It might be as simple as that. Towards the end of the book, we take a look at longevity and sort of the drive to live forever. And it turns out that there is a pill which is already widely prescribed for a condition that isn't aging, that might have dramatic effects on how the body ages. So there may come a point, again, within our lifetimes, where we're going to see the doctor and they go, "Hello, happy 40th birthday. Take this pill once a day for the rest of your life." And there's nothing particularly pharmaceutically advanced about this pill. It costs a few cents to manufacture. It's based on an old herbal remedy being used for thousands of years. But it turns out that it might be a very unlikely wonder drug. So as we move more towards precision medicine and an understanding of treating health rather than reacting to ill health, or maintaining health rather than reacting to ill health, all sorts of interesting possibilities start to crop up.
That last chapter 6, where you talked about the Kahn family and sort of the siblings that all lived past 100, that was my favorite chapter, because like you said, there was a pill, if I remember rightly, it was for type 2 diabetes, and then they found out that taking that pill actually added years to your life. And it was interesting because there's so many people out there that claim, follow this diet and then you'll live longer, follow a vegan diet, you'll live longer. And then there's his siblings who all smoke and overweight and eat like steak every day, and they all live to being over 100. Was it interesting for you it was interesting for me to read that it seems like it's more to do with your genetics, longevity and age, more than perhaps a lifestyle?
Yeah, so the Kahn siblings, they're quite well studied in medical literature. They're the world's oldest living quartet of siblings. So Leonore died in 2005 at the age of 101. Helen was 109 when she passed away in 2011. In 2013, Peter died at the age of 103, and Irving finally was the last to pass away in 2015 at the age of 109. So they all reached age 100. When they were born, remember that they only died very recently. When they were born, the average life expectancy at birth was 40 years. But the problem is the way they live their lives isn't maybe how you might expect. So Helen smoked all day, every day for more than 90 years. She didn't stop, as she says in her own words, because all the doctors who told her to died before she did.
That was so
she
funny.
Famously, it's great, isn't it? She famously hated eating salads and vegetables, but she loved chocolate cocktails and keeping irregular hours. Irving worked up until the age of 108 as an investor on Wall Street, and his son said his father swore by a diet of lamb chops one night and steak the next. If you go and see your doctor and say, "Should I smoke every day for 90 years and only eat steak and lamb chops?" they'd say absolutely not. But what Nir Barzali, the researcher who's done this huge study into longevity, he's based out of the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. What he's done is he's tracked down people who live beyond the age of 100 and still have really, really good health. And he looked at a very specific Jewish community in New York, because they have a very similar demographic profile. They tend to be born into relatively wealthy families, to do similar kinds of jobs. There's not a lot of people in that community go into like jobs that involve a lot of physical labor. The conditions of their life are similar. So that's one variable that's smoothed out. Another way of doing this would be to look at the population of Iceland. Iceland is used quite a bit for this kind of research because there's very little genetic variation between Icelanders. In fact, to such an extent that there's a real risk that you end up sleeping with a cousin unless you know exactly who the person you meet at a bar is. It's not that Icelanders inbred. It's just that there's a very small genetic pool, and it's the same for this community of Jewish people in New York. The reason he opted for the community of Jewish people in New York is because he lives in the Bronx. It's much easier to do than to study Icelanders. So he went and he found all of the people within this community who had lived beyond the age of 100, and then he got in touch with their relatives, their sons and their daughters, to try and understand what was going on. And he studied them in a huge amount of depth. And what he was looking for were the biomarkers of longevity. What was it within these people that was allowing them not to live to 80 and then be walloped by, say, cancer, and then get to 90 and need a hip replacement, and then have some sort of lung condition in their late 90s, early 100s. These people were happy and healthy right up until pretty much the day they died. And then they fell asleep and didn't wake up. And what Bazali wants to do, I think what we all want to do, is to live long, healthy, happy lives and then die very quickly. We don't want to spend the last 20, 30 years of our lives suffering. It's horrible for us and our loved ones. And it's also, matter of factly, it's really expensive. Treating that ill health is a huge burden on society, on the economy, on our health service. So if you could ensure that, not that people died in their 60s, we don't want that to happen. We want to extend life expectancy, and on top of that, we want to extend your health span. That's the number of years in your life that you spend in good health, and we want to reduce down the bit of your life where you're very, very unhealthy to maybe just a few short weeks. Most of these people just have a massive heart attack and die, or just die. They just fall asleep and don't wake up. And what Bazali found were the biomarkers of longevity. So there were certain things that were very common in people that lived healthy lives beyond the age of 100. And then he sort of reverse engineered it. So he had his biomarkers of longevity. Were there treatments that had already been approved that had a similar effect? And he found one. As you said, it was a treatment for type 2 diabetes called metformin. This is one of the most prescribed drugs in the United States. Chances are, if you don't take metformin, someone you know takes metformin. And it turns out that metformin has potentially some of the same effects on your body as exists naturally within people who live beyond the age of 100. And Bazali's argument is that we've now got to a point where it's possible to treat aging as a disease. It's starting to be recognized by regulators and health authorities. And once you can do that, then health services can start prescribing treatments for longevity. Bazali's on the brink of doing the world's first and largest clinical trial to treat aging as a disease, and to understand if by giving people metformin, you can radically increase their health span.
It's a very interesting piece that you wrote on that metformin and the type 2 diabetes and longevity piece. Linked to that was something that I wanted to talk about is there's all this craze at the moment, especially with the Silicon Valley billionaires that want to live for 1,000 years. And they're obviously spending a lot of resource in order to achieve that. In your research, when you were speaking to these doctors, how much of them were saying whether this would be possible, or are they just sort of chasing the fountain of youth to their graves, so to say?
It's very alluring, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I'd be perfectly happy to live on near Bazali's terms, which is you get to 80, 90, 100, 110 maybe, if you're very fortunate and your genetics allow you to. On the other side of that, so, all the medical experts I spoke to were very clear. There is, we are biological, and there is a limit on how long you can keep a biological organism alive. We have a time span, like it or not, and you can't solve death. That's not something that's going to happen. So there are various predictions. A lot of them, as you say, come out of Silicon Valley and are funded to quite a high degree by some very well-known Silicon Valley or big tech figures, Peter Thiel and Jeff Bezos. among them. There are people within the space that are on a crusade to defeat aging, that propose that the first human being to live beyond the age of 1,000 years has probably already been born. That's not true. And this is embedded within some of the largest and most powerful companies in the world. So Bill Maris, he's an entrepreneur in venture capital who founded Calico, which is part of Google. It's Google's longevity lab. He believes that people could live for 500 years. So this is a guy who founded a very significant part of Google's research work, 500 years. There's a startup in Silicon Valley called Ambrosia, which since 2016 has been selling young blood transfusions.
I read that. That was a bit scary. I thought it was really creepy.
Yeah. The blood of children being transfused into adults for something like $8,000 a litre. There's no evidence to suggest that this might work, but it hasn't stopped an awful lot of people pumping an awful lot of money into an awful lot of companies to try and come up with quite outlandish ways of cheating death, if you like. To go back to Nir Bazali, the research he's doing is based on one of the most widely produced and affordable drugs in the world that could allow pretty much all of us, potentially, if all the studies and trials that are going to happen over the next several decades, years and decades, prove his theories, which have a lot of evidence to back them up already. It could be the case that we take a couple of pills every day or every week for our entire lives, and that allows us to be healthy right up until our 100th birthday and beyond, and then die very quickly after having a very long, fulfilling life, which works for me and would be for billions of people around the world huge progress. And it's important to remember, in amongst all of the Silicon Valley hubris, that there are still vast numbers of people in the world who do not have access to even the most basic of healthcare. And the pandemic has really brought that into sharp relief. COVID-19 isn't a disease that treats everyone equally, and it's not because of their genetics or because of their health. It's because of the jobs that they have to do and the living conditions that they're in and how exposed and vulnerable they are. It's been a real stress test for society. So it's kind of funny to sneer and to look at these proposals being made out of Silicon Valley, but all of the real medical experts that I spoke to for this book were incredibly humble and incredibly down to earth, even though they were doing frankly ludicrous things such as coming up with cures for cancer. They were still very much of the mind that we need to double down on what medical research does best, and that by being humble and by maintaining that really close adherence to medical science, we can unlock small benefits that will have unbelievable outcomes for many hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of people. And if we can reduce the cost of ill health and give everyone a better quality of life, that will be of huge benefit to every person on this planet. And that's fundamentally what the book is about.
Definitely. I think towards the end of the book, that's what you noted. I think there was a quote towards the end of the book where you're talking about whether it was just about you want a better life rather than a longer life. And I think the point that you made about the stress on individuals, the stress on families and carers. I know that's something in the UK, we have a sort of carers are under a lot of stress, especially from an aging population. So economic factors of an aging population are massive, which is interesting. So that's an interesting way to end the book, and I thought it was a great way to end the book. One of the things I wanted to talk about was ethical implications. In the book, you talked about treating fatal genetic mutations in utero, so actually before they're actually born. And I wanted to talk about the barriers, both politically and ethically. Obviously, you have religious reasons, or you might have political reasons, even societal, cultural implications to these kind of things. How does science prevail in that situation?
Phrases that tend to get bandied around when you start talking about things like this is playing God. The scientific community is rightfully incredibly cautious around this issue and wants to move incredibly slowly and have an open and honest discussion about the implications of the kinds of technologies that we might be able to develop and very likely will develop within our lifetimes. People might be familiar with the case of where this went slightly wrong, where a rogue doctor in China genetically altered two twins to try and make them less susceptible to a certain disease. That was outside of all regulatory oversight and was widely condemned, and potentially set back progress in this field by several years just by changing people's perceptions of what the medical profession and the medical research profession wants to do in this area. There is a possibility we can do it right now. We can genetically sequence children at the moment they are conceived. There are people who hold incredibly strong beliefs that even something like abortion is immoral and should be illegal, and that's law in some countries in the world, and even in the United States is something that's being aggressively pushed by the sort of the Christian far right, if you like. It's a hugely challenging area. We've not won the argument, if you like, on abortion yet, which is somewhat remarkable to think. All the scientific and ethical evidence says that it is the right thing to do. So to start having conversations about treating rare genetic conditions at the moment of conception, when a child is just a few weeks old inside their mother, there's a huge opportunity. And again, it's necessary to speak very carefully in this area, but the burden that certain conditions that we could cure or we could treat with precision medicine, the burden of those conditions on society, on families, on communities is substantial. And we need to have a very informed, scientifically led discussion about what we do with these new powers. Again, that's slightly the wrong way to put it. With these new technologies that we're going to develop, it would be foolish to say that if we can treat a condition, that we don't continue to develop the technology that will allow us to do that. But we need to be very, very thoughtful about the ethical framework that sits around that. To go back to the case of Mila, the girl with Battons disease, there is a future potentially where the mother and the father sit down with their doctor, their family doctor. The doctor says, "Congratulations on being pregnant. We've done some genetic sequencing, and we found that your child has a very, very high likelihood of being born with a certain condition. We can treat it right now, and they will not be born with that condition, and there is no risk." I think in that framing, it's kind of unimaginable that isn't a future that we're heading towards. But where do you draw the line? What conditions and what interventions do you make, and when? That's incredibly difficult. The important thing is that we keep having this discussion, that the public is involved, is engaged, that politicians and regulators improve communication in this area. There's a reason that so little progress has been made in the area of genetically modified crops, because people think that genetically modifying food is bad. It's not necessarily. That we've been genetically modifying crops for thousands of years through selective breeding. I'm not suggesting that we should selectively breed human beings, but that would be monstrous. But what's important is that people have a real understanding of the scientific possibilities, and then what we're comfortable with doing as a society, and what the nature of the science is. I think we've seen throughout the pandemic that poor communication around public health and around science leads to really, really bad consequences. There's a reason that there's such a successful anti-vaccination movement. That's because in some quarters, we've lost the fight to put forward clear, evidence-based science. There are all sorts of challenges around this, but fundamentally, the science is there, or will be there in a few short years, to unlock all kinds of possibilities to treat rare diseases, to increase people's health span, to make sure that people don't need to suffer for years through brutal treatments for diseases like cancer. We can make huge progress, and we already are. And someone that I spoke to in the book referred to the patients that he'd worked with as pioneers. They're like the astronauts of medical science, being put into these capsules and fired into space so that we all might live better lives. It's an incredibly inspiring message for me. I found it very, very humbling to speak to these people and to the patients that have been through these remarkable journeys on clinical trials. In just a few short years, you will sit down in a doctor's surgery or in a hospital, and without realizing it, you will be prescribed a treatment that is based on your genetic makeup, that is based on you, an individual, rather than someone based on a population average, and you will get better. You won't have to live through many, many years of brutal cancer treatment. You'll just be given one injection, perhaps, and the cancer will dissolve. That's already happening for some people. And it's remarkable to think that in just a few short decades, that progress has been made to get us here, and what might happen in the decades to come that will unlock those possibilities for many millions of people.
The technological revolution when it comes to medicine is fascinating to me. As someone who reads history, to know that only 50, 60 years ago, there was nowhere near the level of technological improvement in the medical industry. A lot of people look at technology and they think of the internet or they think of devices. But to me, the moves that have been made in the medical industry are completely fascinating to me. To one point that you just said, something that I really wanted to touch upon was the fact of information. Someone in your profession as a journalist, obviously your profession is really finding what information is quote unquote true and then sharing that with the general population based on the specific field. What challenges are you finding with that profession in today's environment based on, like we said, individuals perhaps who are anti-vaccination for whatever political, religious, ideological reasons? And how do individuals like yourself who are journalists, how do they proceed in a world where there's such a level of skepticism?
Specifically to anti-vaccination or people who believe in aspects of the QAnon conspiracy theory, the most important thing for everyone in society to do, and that includes journalists, is to engage with these people. You know, they are people, they are human beings, to engage with them and to not drive them further down the rabbit holes that they've got themselves stuck in. You need to engage with people and make it easier for them to come back, to reintegrate into society. You know, part of the reason that conspiracy theories can really take hold in people is they feel like there's no way out, that they're so far down the rabbit hole that they can't possibly escape it. So we need to get better at engaging with these people and not vilifying them, treating them like they're idiots. There's a reason that they've come to believe the things that they believe, and it's on us as a society to help them come back, to help them see the light, if you like.
I think some people though, I would say, even if you present them the information, I still think they're anti-system. They're anti sort of against the whole system of whether it's science or whether it's government. I think you're still going to have some individuals. I understand your point when you're saying that you have to sort of have a dialogue with them, not just shun them to the side because that enhances them. But I still think there'll be a subset of the population that will still be like, the earth is flat. And I'm not going to listen to anything anyone else says. The earth is flat.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very small subset of society that believes the earth is flat. I mean, to look at the vaccination rollout as one example, in the area of South London that I live in, there's a very, very large Muslim population, and the take-up of the vaccine in the United Kingdom is much higher amongst white people as it is of people from BAME communities. So what's happening in my local community is the mosque just down the road from me is a vaccination clinic. That's hugely important, to engage with people on a community level. You know, flat earthers, fine.
Yeah.
People who don't feel that they can engage with a health service because they feel it's discriminatory, because they go and see a white male doctor and he doesn't listen seriously to their concerns because he has underlying prejudices or is just plain racist. You need to find a way to bridge that gap. And you need to find a way as a society to reach out to those people and make them feel safe, and make them feel that in the case of the vaccine, that this is something that they should do for them and their family and their community. So, you know, it's easy to be skeptical when we're faced with huge challenges around people being, you know, quote unquote, fed up of experts. But, you know, everyone has a family. Everyone has someone that they love and respect, you'd hope. And there's always a way to reach out to people and to appeal to their humanity. And, you know, to go back to the book, that's a common thread. We only make progress in small steps. It might feel like giant leaps at times, but they are all small steps made by a huge collective effort of many thousands of people, many millions of people all around the world. Our ability to defeat this pandemic isn't the result of one individual eureka moment. It's the result of real human ingenuity and the success of scientific collaboration. You don't get that by believing that human beings aren't capable of incredible things.
Definitely. On the note of collaboration, I think it'll be a great opportunity to talk about the series of books that Wired have done in relation to Random House, Penguin Random House as well. I know your book is on the future of medicine. This one. But there's two others. There's, I think, actually, is it 5? Is it 3 or is it 6?
It's a series of 6. So we're publishing.
6?
Yeah, we're publishing 3 over the month of March, and then there'll be some more coming out towards the back end of the year in the autumn.
Awesome. That's why I've got 3 here. So the next one is on artificial intelligence by Matt Burgess. Matt and Bianca, who wrote the other one on climate change, actually coming on the podcast in the next couple of weeks. So do you want to just spend the last couple of minutes talking about the work that's happening at Wired in relationship with sort of these big topics, and perhaps giving a bit more of a look behind sort of the mindset at Wired about talking about these concepts?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the kind of journalism that we've been doing since the early 1990s when Wired was founded in San Francisco. I worked for the US edition of the publication. We've been doing this in print and online for many decades. The ambition for this series of books, which we hope is something that continues for many years, is to take these really, really big topics and explain to people what they're all about and what the future looks like. So we're looking at everything from, as you said, climate change and artificial intelligence and healthcare, to quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, and many, many topics. Besides, the aim is to go out and speak to the people in our network, in our world, the experts who are able to almost take out their crystal balls and tell us what the future will look like based on their day-to-day expertise in a particular field. When we're talking about the future of medicine, these are often people who aren't that used to telling their stories. They're more used to publishing in medical journals. It's a real challenge and an honor, as I've said a few times, to translate that work and to bring it to a more general audience. So these are, we hope, punchy, digestible, easy to get to grips with guides to the future of all kinds of industries that someone can sit down and maybe read in just one weekend and feel that they've got a fairly good overview of what the future of medicine looks like, or how we're going to tackle the climate crisis, or the challenges that artificial intelligence is going to pose us over the next decade. And then really it's a jumping off point, right? So if someone reads my book on the future of medicine, I would hope that they were encouraged to go and do loads more reading and to almost treat it as a bit of a primer to spark their imagination and go and find out all about the amazing work that's being done all around the world to achieve all sorts of amazing outcomes.
I definitely second that on the primer. I think books like these are a great introduction to a subject that a lot of people, for instance, artificial intelligence is something that I'm reading a lot about. Max Tegmark and Nick Bostrom are some of the books that I've been reading about artificial intelligence. But if you say to just a normal person, perhaps who doesn't read that much, artificial intelligence, they'll be like, where do I start? And I think
that's it.
These books and yours on the future of medicine, I think, is a great place to start for anyone who's interested. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Where is the best place where people can find you? On social or?
Yep. So on Twitter, I'm at J Temperton. That's pretty much the only platform that I still post on. So that's the best place.
Perfect. James, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free, to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.